Joining us in the studio right now is our KTAR legal analyst, Barry Markson. Barry, I know 137 pages of this report came out. You're a lawyer, so obviously 137 pages is a light read for you from the Justice Department.
It's like nothing.
So what are we to take away from this? There's been a lot of conversation about isolated incidents being blown up, that each one of these incidents should be disclosed, and once the incident is disclosed, disciplinary actions are handled, the problem is solved. This seems to point to something more systemic.
It does. And you know, we all have a tendency, we want to support the police. We do support the police officers, and I think it's important, as we're discussing this, to acknowledge the vast majority of police officers in Phoenix are good officers that do a good job and want to do everything right for the community. And frankly, this report says that they met with many great officers who said, here's what we want to do, here's what we do right, and many who were honest and said, here's some things we should be doing differently. So as we're talking about that, I think that's the context we're in. But they found, this investigation found, that the police department does many things that are unconstitutional, that the Department of Justice considers to be unconstitutional. And I would hope that as a community and as the city and the police department look at this and say, okay, what are we actually doing here? It's not a one at a time thing. It's years and years and years. Is there a pattern? Are we not training appropriately or training enough? Are there things we could do differently that would be better for the community? I would hope that would be the outcome of this.
The Department of Justice, Barry, made a lot of allegations. How do they prove a problem? We just heard from the Assistant Attorney General, Kristen Clark, and she said there was hundreds of hours of body-worn cameras and things like that they looked into. How do they prove that a problem is widespread and systematic versus a one-off or a rogue cop or just a few isolated incidents?
Well, they can do it in a couple of ways. One is data, right? So one of the things that sparked this investigation, let's go back 3 years, why did they even do this? They're not doing this with every city in the country, was that the city of Phoenix, over the course of a couple of years, had more shootings in a year than any other large city. I'm not saying pro rata compared to your population. I'm saying more than any other city except Los Angeles. So that's odd. And I lived here during that.
That's an anomaly.
And we're on the radio here, and I don't remember talking about that.
No,
right? So we're
more
not
than
here.
New York, more than Chicago, more than Philadelphia.
Right.
Okay.
So we shouldn't have that as the 14th largest metro area, as the 5th largest city. We shouldn't have more than those cities, and yet we did. They talked about that the de-escalation training, that in Phoenix there are more. So they looked in and said, okay, why are there more shootings? One of the reasons is that the officers aren't, according to the DOJ, de-escalating situations that can be taken from a heated space to a cooler space and instead get to a shooting. And what they found was, including in de-escalation techniques that the city of Phoenix trains their officers on, is shooting. So how does de-escalation include a shooting? I mean, they're basically saying everything's de-escalation up to and including shooting somebody.
Not just that, up to and including potential, like taking their life, not just shooting them, but potentially killing them.
And that's still called de-escalation.
De-escalation is what they allege.
Right. So those are the sorts of things that, and even the city, by the way, has acknowledged that now. They're doing different de-escalation techniques, and they're supposedly training their police officers, their staff on that. But there are things like that. Now, the other stuff I'll point out, and you guys talked about this, that they alleged discrimination against Black, Hispanic, and Native American populations, and the way they're showing that, again, how are you going to prove it, is the data that they arrest more Black, Hispanic, and Native Americans than white people for the same crimes. Okay.
Based on the population, too.
Right, and it's based on outcomes. So it's based on how many arrests you have compared to the population. But what they don't do is say, are white people committing those crimes and they're not being arrested? Are the police literally watching a white guy and a black guy do the same thing and only arresting the black guy? Or is there just more crime in areas that are underserved or underprivileged, and as a result, which may include more of those minority groups? That's the part that gets me. It shouldn't be based on outcome. Is there real discrimination? If I'm a police officer and I'm watching somebody commit a crime, do I arrest them regardless of their color, or am I looking at their color and deciding whether to arrest them? That, to me, is what discrimination is. So there's things in here you can certainly fight, but some of this data in some ways a bit overwhelming and certainly should be concerning to all of us who live here.
Barry, thanks a lot for being a part of this. The findings are that there's been excessive force, unjustified deadly force, unlawful detention, citations and arrest of people who are homeless, and then throwing away their goods, discrimination against Black, Hispanic, Native American, violated rights of people who are engaged in protected speech and expression, and that the city discriminated against people with behavioral health disabilities when dispatching calls for assistance and responding to people in crisis. So now as we look into this.
That sounds bad. when
It
you
does
stack
sound
up
very
like that.
bad. Where does this all come from? Listen, I've been around the Valley on and off for the last decade. We've seen this happen under multiple police chiefs. It's not as though this is just one problem that suddenly sprung up. Is Phoenix being unfairly maligned? You mentioned that other communities, whether it was Baltimore or Louisville, were being investigated, or Minneapolis, but not all of them. Denver isn't, as far as I know.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, I'll be frank with you. Living here, I don't feel like we have an abusive police department. I've never had that impression being here. But if you look at some of the data, that's kind of what it shows. And it's my guess is if the Department of Justice went into any police department and did a 3-year investigation, they would probably come up with similar findings. That's my guess. I don't know that for
most
sure.
police departments out there?
Just that, yes, because there's always going to be somebody who looks at something and says, "Did you really have to shoot?" I mean, people second guess police all the time, right? So it's easy to do that.
Is that fair to the cops, though?
No.
I don't mean to cut you off, Barry, but if you're saying something that I feel like is right, that if the DOJ gets called in to look at most, let's just say, big city police departments out there, they're going to be able to find something.
Yeah, no, I think that's probably true. And look, some of this, and Chris just went through the list, it's things like homelessness, which every city has. And the report acknowledges that this isn't something caused by the police, but it's how they deal with it. The police here, the policy was to take people off the street because this is what we want in Phoenix, right? We don't want to turn into Santa Monica or San Francisco where there's just homeless tents on every street, and we don't want that here.
You don't want it in your neighborhood. Chris doesn't want it in his. I don't want it in mine.
I'd like it in your neighborhood, but otherwise...
I don't want it in mine. I would be okay if it was in yours.
So the police are doing what the policy is, and they were told to take people to the zone. That's what they remember. The zone. That's where they were taking them.
Right.
That was the city's policy. Is that the police department's fault that they were doing what they were told? No. But what the findings of this are is that it's unconstitutional to take someone's personal property, even if they're homeless. It's unconstitutional to take all their stuff and pack it away and drive them to another part of the city. This report says you can't do that it's unconstitutional. Were the police doing that? Yeah, they were doing that. We knew they were doing that.
Well, the report goes beyond that, too. The shocking stat to Chris and I was 37% of the arrests between 2016 and 2022 were of homeless people.
Right. And that's a huge number. I agree with you. I had that highlighted as well. It's a big number, but that again is these are folks who don't have jobs, they don't have money, they have in many cases there's mental illness involved, which also brings up the mental illness part of this report. It's a small percentage of the population that the police are dealing with a lot, and the question is, from a constitutional perspective, how do you deal with those people and keep the rest of us safe and happy? And if apparently what the DOJ is saying is some of what Phoenix did was unconstitutional, the way they handled it. Now, the other option is we've seen it. You go to California, to some of the cities in California and other parts of the country, and they just let the homeless live wherever they want. They don't bother them. They don't do anything. Then they don't have these charges levied against the police, but is that the kind of community we want to live in? So, again, I don't blame the police for that. They're doing what they were told to do under the city of Phoenix's policy, and now the department's getting hit for that. I'm a little more concerned with why do we have more shootings than almost any other city in the country? Why are our de-escalation techniques something that should be lessened? Certainly there's questions if we're arresting and doing more arrests of minority groups rather than white people. I'd like to know why that is. If 37% of the people being arrested are homeless, what is the population, the demographic population of the homeless people that we have here? Is that overwhelmingly Black, Hispanic, and Native American? If that's the case, that helps with those numbers. I understand the numbers more now. That doesn't necessarily mean discrimination. It just means they're going where the crimes are, and that's who they're arresting.
Barry Markson is our KTAR legal analyst. One of the things that we've discussed as we try to parse this data and then understand it for ourselves is where the bias enters in. Is there an unconscious bias that is happening perhaps in the minds of the police officers, and can training sort of counter some of that? In other words, can the training be improved to say somebody is in this neighborhood, that person looks suspicious, and why do I think that person looks suspicious? Maybe it simply is because I was raised in my neighborhood and my upbringing makes me believe that guy looks suspicious. Can that be trained out of somebody?
Well, look, we all have that, right? That's natural.
Yeah.
We can't necessarily get rid of that, but if there's additional biases added on to that, and as a police officer, you have to be able to separate yourself from that. All of us have, we distinguish people, we group people. It's just how our brains work, but you have to kind of fight that and do it a different way. Again, if that's something that's really happening in the Phoenix Police Department, as this report indicates, yes, there's training they can do. There's certainly ways they can be instructed on here's what you do, here's how you try to get your mind in a place where you're not discriminating, and look at it. Am I going after this person because of the crime? Would I do the same thing if the person was a middle-aged white guy in Scottsdale as I am a 20-year-old black guy in South Phoenix? And those are things that can be trained. They can do stuff like that. So this is not a pleasant report. I think we all knew it was coming. I don't think anybody thought this DOJ report was going to come out and say, "Boy, that Phoenix Police Department's fantastic." Right? Nobody has a 3-year DOJ investigation and they come out and go, "That was pleasant. I like that." The question I think going forward is going to be, what does the city of Phoenix do and the police department do to address some of these issues? Which some of these are real. They do need to be addressed, and the city's already trying to address them. And the report talks about that. And how does the Department of Justice move to cooperate, as they're saying, with the city of Phoenix to make this work in a way that is positive for them.
Thanks for watching The Chris and Joe Show. Click to see more from Chris and Joe, and tap the button in the middle to subscribe to KTAR News.